Jake Morrison was having a bad day, though he didn't realize yet just how bad it was about to get. He'd been working on Haven Point Space Station for approximately 14 months, long enough to understand that the station's infrastructure was held together through combination of creative engineering, persistent optimism, and what his supervisor cheerfully called aggressive improvisation. Today's assignment was a malfunctioning door panel in the diplomatic housing wing, specifically cabin 47C, according to his work order tablet. Door controls that don't respond properly are actually a serious safety concern despite seeming minor, because in emergency situations people need reliable access to living spaces. So Jake had grabbed his diagnostic kit, navigated through the station's confusing corridor system designed by multiple species with completely incompatible architectural philosophies, and arrived at what he believed was the correct cabin. Haven Point was one of the larger multi-species stations in this sector, serving as a hub for trade, diplomacy, cultural exchange, and the kind of interpersonal connections that happen when you put thousands of beings from dozens of civilizations in close proximity for extended periods. It had been constructed over decades through collaborative effort that resulted in a fascinating patchwork of different design aesthetics and engineering standards, all of which had to somehow function as a cohesive whole despite fundamental incompatibilities. Jake's job as maintenance technician meant he dealt with those incompatibilities constantly, troubleshooting systems that were never quite designed to work together but had to work together anyway. He was good at his job, patient, methodical, skilled at improvising solutions when proper parts weren't available through official channels. He developed reputation as someone who could fix problems other technicians gave up on, which meant he got assigned the particularly frustrating malfunctions like this door control that was intermittently non-responsive. Standing in front of what his tablet's translation software identified as Cabin 47C, Jake examined the door control panel with practiced eye. The interface was Syreni design, all elegant curves and touch-sensitive surfaces that theoretically provided intuitive control, but which in practice required understanding of Syreni gestural language that most non-Syreni never quite mastered. He pulled up Diagnostic Interface on his tablet, attempting to run standard system check, and immediately encountered problems. The door control wasn't responding to his technician override codes correctly, cycling through error states that suggested corrupted programming or possible hardware failure. Jake spent 15 minutes attempting various diagnostic approaches, each one meeting with different but equally frustrating failure. The panel would respond to some commands but not others, would sometimes recognize his authorization and sometimes reject it, would display readouts that contradicted each other about the system's actual status. This was exactly the kind of inconsistent malfunction that drove technicians to drink. Finally, Jake made a decision that seemed reasonable at the time, but which he would later recognize as catastrophic error in judgment. He used the manual emergency override. This was physical bypass built into all door systems, designed to allow emergency access when electronic controls failed completely. Technicians weren't supposed to use emergency override for routine repairs, but Jake had done it before when dealing with particularly stubborn systems, and it had never caused problems beyond some minor violations of protocol that his supervisor usually overlooked, because the alternative was leaving systems unfixed indefinitely. He activated the override, and the door slid open with grinding mechanical sound that indicated it was operating on backup power rather than standard systems. Jake stepped through the doorway, his attention focused on his diagnostic tablet and the technical readouts showing panel status. He was already mentally composing the repair report he'd need to file, noting the specific error codes and failed diagnostic attempts. He was 3 steps into the cabin before his brain processed what his eyes were registering. There was someone in the cabin. Jake's first coherent thought was acute embarrassment. He just walked into someone's private quarters without proper warning, which was exactly the kind of social violation that made interactions awkward. His second thought died entirely when he actually comprehended what he was seeing. There was a Syreni woman in the middle of the cabin, and she was engaged in something that made Jake's mind short-circuit with combination of confusion, embarrassment, and growing horror that he'd interrupted something deeply private. The Syreni as a species were known throughout this sector for several things. Their distinctive long ears that moved expressively to communicate subtext alongside their spoken words, their elegant features that many species found aesthetically beautiful, their sophisticated diplomatic culture, and their intensely private customs about emotional expression. Jake's cultural training, the mandatory coursework all station personnel received about the various species they'd be working with, had covered Syreni customs only superficially, focusing on practical matters of professional interaction rather than deep cultural practices that outsiders wouldn't normally encounter. The woman was kneeling in the center of her cabin, positioned before an arrangement of crystalline structures that pulsed with soft bioluminescent light. Her formal outer robes, the elaborately layered garments that Syreni wore for all public interactions, were carefully folded and placed to one side. What she wore instead was something much simpler, a single-layer undergarment that looked almost vulnerable in its plainness compared to the formal attire Jake had only ever seen Syreni wearing in public spaces. But more striking than her clothing was her posture and expression. Her ears, which Syreni always maintained in carefully controlled positions that communicated appropriate social signals, were flat against her head in a position Jake had never seen any Syreni adopt in public. It suggested either intense negative emotion or perhaps complete absence of social performance. Her face showed expression of such profound vulnerability and openness that Jake instinctively knew he was seeing something that wasn't meant to be witnessed. Her hands were moving through the air above the crystalline structures in complex gestures that seemed ritualistic, deliberate in ways that suggested deep cultural significance. The crystals responded to her movements, their bioluminescence shifting in patterns that Jake's pattern recognition instincts read as somehow connected to her emotional state. There was an atmosphere in the cabin that Jake struggled to define, something sacred, intensely personal, like he'd accidentally walked into a church during private prayer or a therapy session, or some intimate moment that required absolute privacy to maintain its meaning. For one frozen moment that felt much longer than the few seconds it actually occupied, Jake and the Syreni woman stared at each other. Her expression cycled through several emotions in rapid succession: shock, horror, something that looked like grief, and her ears snapped upright in the position that Jake's training identified as alarm or extreme distress. Jake's brain finally caught up with the situation, flooding him with mortification so intense it felt physical. This was bad. This was really, catastrophically bad. He had no idea what he'd just interrupted, but the woman's reaction made it absolutely clear that his presence was violation of something important. "Oh God, I'm so sorry." The words burst out of Jake's mouth as he immediately began backing toward the door, his hands raised in apologetic gesture. "Wrong cabin. The panel, it's malfunctioning. I thought this was. I'm leaving right now. I didn't see anything. I'm so sorry." He was stumbling over his words and simultaneously stumbling over his own feet, his face burning with embarrassment that felt completely inadequate to the situation. His professional brain was screaming at him that he just committed exactly the kind of boundary violation that could get him fired, possibly blacklisted from station work entirely. His human social instincts were screaming that he'd witnessed something deeply personal, and he needed to remove himself from the situation immediately to minimize damage. He managed to get back through the doorway, nearly tripping over his own equipment in his haste. The door ground closed behind him with that same mechanical sound, and Jake found himself standing in the corridor, his heart pounding, his mind racing through what had just happened and trying to calculate exactly how catastrophically he just ruined his career and possibly created diplomatic incident. A quick glance at his tablet confirmed what he'd already begun to suspect. The corridor signage was faulty, and what he'd read as 47C was actually 41C when properly interpreted through the station's inconsistent labeling system. He'd been in completely the wrong cabin. He'd used emergency override to enter private quarters without authorization. He'd walked in on someone during what was clearly a very private moment. And worse, if he'd inadvertently violated some Syreni cultural protocol about privacy or sacred practices, there could be diplomatic consequences beyond just his personal employment situation. Jake stood frozen in the corridor, trying to decide on appropriate next steps. Report himself to his supervisor immediately. File formal apology through proper channels. Attempt to make personal apology to the resident whose privacy he'd violated. Just quietly fix the actual door malfunction he'd been assigned and hope no one reported the incident. His training suggested formal reporting was correct, but his instinct was screaming that he needed to make sure the woman he'd interrupted was okay before worrying about procedural compliance. Before he could decide on a course of action, the cabin door ground open again. The Syreni woman was standing there, now wearing her formal outer robes again, though Jake noticed she'd donned them quickly. The layers weren't perfectly arranged the way Syreni typically maintained their appearance. Her ears were in a position Jake couldn't interpret with his limited cultural knowledge, and her expression was complicated in ways that suggested she was managing multiple strong emotions while trying to maintain social composure. "You are the human technician," she said, and her voice was carefully controlled, but underneath it was something that sounded like shock or possibly distress that hadn't been fully processed yet. "Yes, I'm so incredibly sorry." Jake immediately launched into apology mode, his words tumbling out rapidly. "The door panel was malfunctioning, and I read the cabin number wrong because the signage system is unreliable, and I used emergency override because the standard access codes weren't working properly. And I absolutely did not mean to intrude on your privacy, and I'll file formal apology through proper channels and report myself to station administration immediately for boundary violation and—" "Stop," she interrupted, holding up one hand in gesture that looked universal for "please cease talking." "You witnessed the Sharvana, the unveiling ritual. This is—" She paused, seeming to search for words in Terran standard that would adequately convey meaning. "This is very serious. You should not have seen. No outsider should ever see. But you did see. And now—" She stopped again, her ears doing something complicated that Jake suspected indicated emotional distress she was working hard not to show. "Now there are consequences that neither of us intended, but both of us must face according to my people's traditions. You will need to come inside. We must speak about what happens now when someone witnesses unveiling accidentally." Jake's confusion must have shown clearly on his face, because she added with what sounded like tired resignation. "This is not optional, human. By witnessing the unveiling, you have become bound by cultural laws older than your species' spaceflight. Whether either of us likes this situation, we are now connected in ways that cannot be ignored without causing harm to both of us. Come inside. I will explain what you have accidentally done and what it means for both of us going forward." She turned and walked back into her cabin, clearly expecting Jake to follow. Jake hesitated, his mind racing through the implications of what she was saying. Bound by cultural laws, connected, consequences. None of this sounded good, but refusing to follow would probably make everything worse. He stepped through the doorway, properly invited this time at least, and heard the door grind close behind him, cutting off his escape route and committing him to whatever conversation was about to happen. This was definitely the worst door malfunction repair he'd ever attempted. Jake followed the Syreni woman back into her cabin with profound reluctance, every instinct screaming that this conversation was going to be even more uncomfortable than the initial incident. He tried to keep his gaze carefully neutral, not looking at the crystal arrangement or anything else that might seem like he was being intrusive or curious about her private practices. She gestured toward a chair that appeared configured for humanoid physiology. The station's quarters included adaptable furniture for multi-species accommodation, and Jake sat carefully, perching on the edge as if ready to flee at any moment. The woman settled into a seated position on a cushion designed for Syreni physiology, her posture now perfectly composed in ways that contrasted sharply with the vulnerable openness Jake had accidentally witnessed earlier. Her ears were carefully positioned in what Jake's limited training recognized as formal neutral position, appropriate for serious conversations between individuals who weren't close friends or family. There was a long moment of uncomfortable silence where Jake fought the urge to start apologizing again, finally broken when she spoke with careful formality. "My name is Lyra'esh, junior diplomatic attaché with the Syreni Cultural Exchange Mission. I have been stationed on Haven Point for 6 standard months, working to improve mutual understanding between my people and the various species who populate this sector. In those 6 months of careful adherence to all protocols and all propriety, I have now had my most sacred privacy violated by accident." She wasn't angry, or at least, she didn't sound angry in ways Jake's human instincts could recognize. Her voice was carefully modulated, perfectly controlled in that way Syreni seemed to maintain constantly in public interactions. But underneath the control, Jake detected something that sounded like exhaustion mixed with resignation, as if she was dealing with situations she desperately hoped would never happen but which she was now grimly committed to handling properly. Jake winced, the guilt he'd been feeling intensifying. "I really am incredibly sorry. I know sorry doesn't fix anything, but I want you to know it was completely unintentional and it does not fix anything," Lyra'esh confirmed, cutting him off gently but firmly. "But I do not blame you for malfunction of technology or mislabeling of cabins. This is station incompetence and infrastructural failure, not your malice or intentional violation. However, blame is irrelevant now. What matters is consequence and how we handle what has occurred." She took a breath, her ears shifting slightly in ways Jake couldn't interpret. "The ritual you witnessed is called Sharvana in my language. Your translation software likely rendered it as the Unveiling, or the true self revealed, or some similarly approximate phrase. It is the most private practice my people maintain. We perform it alone, in absolutely secure spaces that should never be intruded upon, as method of removing the emotional armor we wear constantly in all public interactions. You saw me without my defensive masks, human. You saw vulnerability that Syreni show to no one. Not friends, not family, not even bonded partners until relationships reach deepest possible trust that typically requires years to develop." Jake was beginning to understand the magnitude of what he'd accidentally witnessed. "It's like, I accidentally saw you emotionally naked, saw you in moment of complete vulnerability that your culture requires to be absolutely private." "Yes, exactly yes." Lyra'esh's ears flattened slightly, that same position Jake had witnessed earlier, and which he was now beginning to understand indicated significant emotional distress she was working hard to control. Syreni culture requires perfect emotional control in all public interactions. We present carefully curated versions of ourselves to maintain social harmony and political stability. This is not deception. We would not characterize it as lying. It is social necessity. We believe that uncontrolled emotional expression causes conflict, that civilization requires individuals to manage their feelings privately rather than inflicting them on others through public display. She paused, gathering her thoughts. But perfect control without release is psychologically toxic. Emotions that are suppressed constantly will either erupt inappropriately or will damage the individual internally. So we developed Unveiling ritual as solution. In absolute privacy, secured against any witnessing, Syreni remove all emotional controls. We allow ourselves to feel and express everything we suppress publicly. We process emotions in raw form without social consequences. The crystals you saw, they are meditation focuses that respond to emotional states, providing feedback that helps us understand our own feelings more clearly. The vulnerable posture and expression you witnessed was me allowing myself to be completely genuine for first time in weeks. No performance, no armor, no social mask, just raw emotional honesty. Jake tried to imagine what that must be like, to maintain perfect emotional control constantly, only allowing genuine feelings in absolute privacy. It sounded exhausting and psychologically difficult in ways he was struggling to fully comprehend. So by witnessing your unveiling, I saw you at your most vulnerable. I saw emotions and genuine self that you show to literally no one in your normal life. Precisely. Lyra'esh's voice was quiet now, almost pained. We are taught from childhood that showing true emotions publicly is weakness that invites exploitation and damages social bonds. That perfect control is highest virtue. But perfect control without private release is psychological poison. So we unveil in spaces we believe to be absolutely secure, and we are completely, terrifyingly vulnerable in those moments. And we trust that our privacy will be respected, because violation would be psychologically catastrophic. You saw me without any of the social masks I wear constantly in public. You saw emotions I show to no one. You saw me as I truly am rather than as I perform being. This is why what happened is so serious, human. It is not just embarrassment or awkward social moment. It is fundamental violation of most sacred privacy my people maintain. Jake felt the weight of what she was explaining settle heavily on him. You must feel completely exposed around me now. Like I have knowledge of you that I was never supposed to have. That changes everything about how we can interact. Yes, Lyra'esh admitted, her voice barely above whisper. Every time I see you now, I will remember that you have seen me without any defenses. It is profoundly uncomfortable in ways I struggle to express in your language. It is vulnerability I can never take back, knowledge you carry whether either of us wishes you carried it. But, she paused, her ears doing something complex. But there are traditional structures for handling this exact situation, because despite all our precautions, accidental witnessing does occasionally occur throughout our history. We have laws called kathara, the bond of inner truth. When someone witnesses another performing sharvana, both parties become bound by obligations that our traditions say must be honored to prevent psychological harm to both. What kind of obligations? Jake asked carefully, trying to keep his voice neutral and receptive rather than defensive. You must learn why the ritual is sacred, Lyra'esh explained, her tone taking on formal quality like she was reciting something she'd been taught. You must understand what you saw so that the vulnerability is not wasted or dismissed as strange alien custom. If you witness someone's true self by accident, you carry responsibility to honor that truth by understanding it rather than treating it as irrelevant embarrassment to be forgotten. And I must. She hesitated, clearly finding the next part difficult. I must teach you, must share with you the meaning and significance of what you witnessed, must allow you to understand why Syreni hide ourselves and what it costs us to maintain our public faces constantly. This is not punishment for either of us. It is recognition that you now carry knowledge of me that fundamentally changes relationship between us whether we want it changed or not, and that ignoring this change would be psychologically harmful for both of us. So we're bound together, by your cultural law. Jake tried to wrap his mind around this. For how long? What exactly does this bond require? By recognition of psychological reality that law simply codifies, Lyra'esh corrected gently. The law acknowledges what is already true, that you have seen me in moment of complete vulnerability, That this creates connection between us whether we acknowledge it or ignore it. That ignoring it would cause harm while acknowledging and understanding it provides framework for integration. As for duration, the bond is permanent in sense that you will always carry this knowledge of me, but the active obligations of teaching and learning typically last several months while proper understanding is developed. After that, we both carry understanding forward in whatever way serves us best. She met his eyes directly, and Jake was struck by how much this clearly cost her, meeting his gaze when he'd seen her at her most vulnerable. I know this is unfair to you. You did not seek this connection or these obligations. You were doing your job, and station incompetence put you in position to violate my privacy completely by accident. But neither did I seek to have my most private moment witnessed by stranger. We are both victims of unfortunate circumstance. The question now is whether we handle it with grace that honors both our needs, or with resistance that will only make everything worse for both of us. Jake processed this, his mind working through implications. What happens if I refuse? If I just file formal apology and avoid you forever and pretend this never happened? Then you carry knowledge of my vulnerability without understanding its significance, Lyra'esh said quietly, and there was genuine pain in her voice now despite her obvious efforts to maintain control. You become person who has seen me at my most exposed, but who dismisses it as irrelevant or treats it as embarrassing incident to forget, rather than significant moment to honor. This would be deeply painful for me, not in way that requires legal remedy, but in way that would cause genuine psychological harm that your people might characterize as emotional wound that never properly heals. And for you, you would carry guilt and confusion about what you accidentally violated without ever understanding what it truly meant, why it mattered, how to process the experience in a healthy way. This is not good foundation for continuing to work on same station, where we will inevitably encounter each other in corridors and public spaces. She had an excellent point, Jake realized. Haven Point wasn't that large, and they were both going to be here for foreseeable future. The diplomatic housing wing where he'd had this accident was an area he regularly worked in for maintenance calls. Avoiding Lyra'esh forever would be difficult, awkward, and would probably make them both uncomfortable every time they accidentally encountered each other. Understanding, even if it required time and effort, might at least make the situation manageable for both of them. Okay, Jake said slowly, making a decision he hoped he wouldn't regret. I'll learn. I'll try to understand what I saw and why it matters. But I need you to know that I never wanted to intrude on your privacy, that I respect how serious this is even if I don't fully understand all the implications yet, and that if there's any way I can make this less awful for you going forward, I'll do whatever you think is appropriate. Something in Lyra'esh's expression softened slightly, her ears shifting to position that seemed less distressed. That is more considerate response than I expected, human. I appreciate your willingness to engage with this situation properly rather than dismissing it or becoming defensive. This will still be uncomfortable for both of us, but your attitude suggests it might be manageable rather than catastrophic. Thank you. I'm Jake, by the way, he offered, figuring if they were going to be bound by some cultural obligation for months, they might as well use actual names. Jake Morrison, human maintenance technician, usually dealing with broken infrastructure rather than cultural incidents, completely out of my depth with this whole situation. Jake, Lyra'esh repeated, testing the name. I am Lyra'esh, though you may shorten it to just Lyra if you find the full name difficult. I am also completely out of my depth. I have never been in position of teaching Kethara understanding before, and I had desperately hoped I would never be witnessed during Unveiling in first place. But here we are, and we will navigate this together as best we can. She stood with fluid grace, her formal composure fully restored now. We should meet regularly for what I will call understanding sessions, structured time where I teach you about Syreni culture and emotional practices with depth and honesty that outsiders normally never receive. Is your schedule regular enough to accommodate this? Jake consulted his duty roster on his tablet. I work day shifts, usually off-duty after 1800 hours station time. I could meet you in evenings if that works. Evenings would be suitable. Lyra'esh moved to a calendar display on her cabin wall. Let us schedule initial sessions 3 times per week, adjusting frequency as we determine what pace of learning serves us both best. First session tomorrow evening. Here in my cabin where privacy is assured, and where being seen entering my quarters together will be explainable through Cathara obligations. Species. My superiors will need to know so they can properly contextualize any changes in my behavior or work that might result from processing this violation. And your supervisors should probably be notified as well, so they understand why you'll be spending significant time with me, and can adjust your work assignments if necessary to avoid conflicts with our understanding sessions. This was getting more complicated by the moment. So this is going to become official diplomatic incident with paperwork and everything. Yes, though not diplomatic crisis requiring formal negotiations or anything quite so dramatic, Lyra'esh assured him. More like officially acknowledged cultural situation requiring proper handling through established protocols. Better to document properly than to hide it, and have it emerge later in ways that create suspicion or misunderstanding. She was probably right, though Jake really wasn't looking forward to the conversations with his supervisor about accidentally violating an alien diplomat's sacred privacy. Okay. I'll report to my supervisor tomorrow and explain what happened. You'll handle your diplomatic superiors. We'll meet tomorrow evening for the first understanding session, and hopefully in a few months this will all be resolved and we can both move forward without it being weird forever. That is the hope, Lyra'esh agreed, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced it would be that simple. Until tomorrow evening then, Jake Morrison, and please, do not speak about what you witnessed to anyone other than your immediate supervisor. What occurs during unveiling is private knowledge that should not be shared casually, even in context of explaining how you accidentally witnessed it. Understood, Jake confirmed. I won't gossip about it or treat it as entertaining story. I know it's serious even if I don't fully understand all the implications yet. He moved toward the door, which opened properly this time. Apparently it was functioning correctly when used from inside the cabin. He paused in the doorway. For what it's worth, I really am sorry this happened. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I want you to know I'm taking this seriously. I know you are, Lyra'esh said quietly. That helps more than you might think. Until tomorrow, Jake. Jake left her cabin and stood in the corridor for a long moment, trying to process everything that had just happened. He'd gone from routine door repair to accidentally witnessing sacred ritual to being bound by cultural obligations that would require months of his time and had the potential to cause diplomatic complications. This was definitely the strangest day of his career and probably of his entire life. He looked at his tablet, at the actual door malfunction he'd been assigned to repair, the real cabin 47C, several doors down from where he'd accidentally intruded. He should probably fix that before someone else tried to access it and encountered similar problems, though the idea of doing more door repairs right now felt almost laughably mundane after the conversation he just had. Jake sighed, grabbed his diagnostic kit more firmly, and headed toward the correct cabin. At least fixing actual doors was straightforward, and didn't involve accidentally binding yourself to alien diplomats through cultural laws you'd never heard of. He'd file his reports tomorrow, start his understanding sessions with Lyra tomorrow evening, and hope that somehow this entire catastrophic situation would eventually become manageable. Right now, though, he just wanted to repair one door correctly and get through the rest of his shift without causing any additional diplomatic incidents. The malfunctioning door panel at the real cabin 47C turned out to be simple software corruption that he fixed in 15 minutes. If only his personal situation could be resolved so easily. Over the following weeks, Jake found himself living through what had to be the strangest educational experience of his life. 3 times per week, after his maintenance shift ended, he would report to Lyra's cabin for what she called understanding sessions. Structured time where she taught him about Syreni culture with a depth and honesty that she repeatedly emphasized no outsider normally received. The first several sessions were profoundly uncomfortable for both of them. Lyra clearly struggled with teaching someone who'd witnessed her at her most vulnerable, and Jake struggled with how to be appropriately respectful and engaged without seeming too curious about her personal practices. But gradually, the acute discomfort faded into something more workable. Lyra proved to be an excellent teacher when she wasn't actively fighting embarrassment about what Jake had witnessed. She explained Syreni culture systematically, starting with foundational concepts and building toward more complex understanding. Syreni civilization, she explained, was built on principle of emotional performance as social necessity. From early childhood, Syreni were trained to present carefully controlled personas in all public interactions, dignified, composed, emotionally restrained to degree that other species often found the Syreni cold or difficult to read emotionally. This is not deception, Lyra emphasized during one early session. We do not consider it lying to perform emotions publicly while feeling different things privately. We consider it social responsibility. Our philosophy holds that uncontrolled emotional expression causes conflict, damages relationships, creates instability. Civilization, we believe, requires individuals to manage their feelings privately rather than inflicting them on others through public display that serves no purpose except self-indulgence at others' expense. She pulled up holographic displays showing Syreni child-rearing practices, educational systems designed to teach emotional control, social structures that reinforced performance as virtue. We are taught that showing true emotions publicly is weakness that invites exploitation and damages our ability to function in society. That perfect control is highest achievement of mature individual. That managing our own emotional needs privately is how we contribute to collective social harmony. But that sounds incredibly exhausting, Jake observed, watching the educational materials with growing understanding of just how much psychological work went into being Syreni in public spaces. Maintaining perfect control constantly, never letting yourself show genuine feelings except in absolute privacy. That's got to create enormous psychological pressure. It does, Lyra admitted quietly, which is precisely why the unveiling ritual exists as necessary release valve. Perfect control without private release is psychological poison. Emotions that are suppressed constantly will either erupt inappropriately when control inevitably fails under stress, or they will damage the individual internally through what your human psychology might call repression trauma or emotional dissociation disorders. We recognized this reality millennia ago and developed Unveiling as cultural solution. She explained the ritual in much greater detail than Jake had initially understood. The unveiling wasn't just meditation or private emotional time. It was structured practice developed over centuries, refined through collective cultural experience, designed specifically to allow Syreni to safely process emotions they could never show publicly. The crystals Jake had seen were specialized technology, engineered to respond to emotional states through biochemical sensors, and provide real-time feedback that helped practitioners understand their own feelings more clearly. The vulnerable posture, the specific gestures, the meditative state, all of it was carefully designed to facilitate complete emotional honesty in controlled private environment. When we unveil, we remove all social masks completely, Lyra explained, and her ears were in that flat, distressed position again as she discussed what Jake had witnessed. We allow ourselves to feel everything we suppress publicly: grief, anger, fear, loneliness, desire, all the emotions that perfect control requires us to manage privately. We express them without any social consequences, process them in raw form without worrying about how others will perceive us. And when we finish and return to public spaces, we are psychologically healthier because we have processed emotions properly rather than simply suppressing them indefinitely. And all of this happens in absolute privacy, Jake said, beginning to truly understand why his accidental witnessing had been so catastrophic. Because if someone sees you unveiled, they see all the emotions you never show publicly. They see you without any of the control and dignity that your culture values as highest virtue. They see you being what your culture would characterize as weak or undisciplined, even though you know intellectually that unveiling is necessary for psychological health. Exactly, Lyra confirmed. In that moment when you walked through my door, you saw me at my most vulnerable. You saw emotions I show to absolutely no one in normal circumstances. You saw me without any of the social masks I wear constantly in public spaces. You saw me as I truly am rather than as I perform being. This is why the Kethara bond exists, because once someone has seen you that completely, pretending they haven't seen anything creates cognitive dissonance that harms both parties. Witness carries knowledge that changes everything about how you perceive the witnessed. Witness knows that someone carries that knowledge and cannot comfortably interact with witness while pretending the knowledge doesn't exist. Better to acknowledge reality and create framework for integration than to ignore it and suffer psychological consequences. Jake was beginning to understand the profound psychological impact of what had happened. So you can't just forget that I saw you unveiled. Every time you see me, you remember that I have that knowledge of you. And I can't just forget what I saw either, now that I understand what it means. I know that I witnessed something sacred and intensely private, and that changes how I perceive you. Yes, you understand correctly. Lyra's voice was quiet. This is why the Kethara obligations exist, not as punishment, but as structure for processing this connection in a healthy way rather than leaving both parties to struggle with it independently. You learn to understand what you witnessed, so the vulnerability is not wasted or dismissed. I teach you, which helps me reclaim some agency over knowledge you carry by ensuring you understand it properly rather than misinterpreting it. We both integrate this knowledge into our relationship in conscious way rather than having it exist as unaddressed trauma creating ongoing discomfort. As weeks passed and sessions continued, Jake noticed something shifting. The acute discomfort that had dominated their early interactions was gradually fading, replaced by something else. Not quite friendship yet, but genuine connection built on unexpected honesty that neither of them had anticipated. Lyra began sharing more than just cultural education. She talked about her work as diplomatic attaché, the pressures of representing her entire species while maintaining perfect emotional control, the loneliness of being one of relatively few Syreni on Haven Point, with no one who truly understood the psychological costs of constant performance. I maintain perfect composure in all official interactions, she said during one session that had drifted into more personal territory than their usual cultural lessons. I present exactly the image of Syreni dignity and capability that my superiors expect. I negotiate cultural exchanges, resolve minor diplomatic incidents, represent my people's interests with appropriate gravitas. And every day I feel the pressure building. Emotions I cannot show publicly, stress I cannot express, loneliness I cannot admit to because acknowledging it would suggest weakness. So I unveil regularly to maintain psychological health, and I am absolutely isolated in those moments because no one on this station understands what it means to be Syreni, what it costs to maintain our social masks constantly. That sounds incredibly lonely, Jake said, and found himself sharing his own experiences without quite meaning to. I mean, I know it's not the same, but I understand some of that isolation. I'm one of maybe 30 humans on a station with thousands of beings from dozens of species. Most of my interactions are professional and surface level. I don't have close friends here because everyone is busy with their own work and lives, and forming deep connections across species barriers is harder than anyone wants to admit. I spend a lot of time alone in my quarters after my shift ends, and sometimes that's okay, but sometimes it's really not. Lyra's ears tilted toward him in position he'd learned indicated focused attention and something like sympathy. Humans also experience loneliness from isolation. I had assumed your species' greater comfort with emotional expression meant you formed connections more easily. Emotional expression doesn't automatically create genuine connection, Jake explained. Humans are pretty good at surface-level social interaction. We can make small talk, joke around, be friendly in professional contexts. But deep connection, that requires vulnerability and time and compatible personalities. And all of that is hard to find even when everyone speaks the same language and shares the same cultural background. Add in species differences and it gets exponentially harder. I'm friendly with my coworkers, but I wouldn't say I'm close friends with any of them. Mostly I just do my job, go back to my quarters, and try to find ways to fill time that don't involve thinking too hard about how isolated I feel sometimes. They looked at each other for a moment. Two beings from completely different species and cultural backgrounds recognizing shared experience of loneliness, despite the vast differences in how their societies operated. Perhaps we are not so different after all, Lyra said quietly. Your species and mine approach emotional management from opposite directions. You express more publicly while we control more privately. But we both experience isolation when genuine connection is difficult to achieve. Yeah, Jake agreed. Maybe that's part of why the Kethara obligations exist. Not just to process the specific incident of accidental witnessing, but because being forced to spend time together and be honest with each other creates opportunity for actual connection that both parties might need even if they never would have sought it out independently. Their conversations began extending beyond the scheduled understanding sessions. Lyra started asking questions about human emotional practices with genuine curiosity rather than just performing diplomatic interest. Did humans also maintain social masks, or did their comfort with public emotional expression mean they were always authentic? How did humans handle emotions that were socially inappropriate? Did they have private practices similar to unveiling, or did they simply express everything publicly regardless of social consequences? Jake shared what he knew about human emotional culture, explaining that humans absolutely did maintain social masks, just differently than Syreni. Professional contexts required emotional restraint that could be just as performative as Syreni dignity. Social etiquette involved managing expressions to avoid giving offense or making situations uncomfortable. Humans were more emotionally expressive than Syreni, yes, but that didn't mean they showed their complete authentic selves constantly in all interactions. We have workplace professionalism, social politeness, all these unwritten rules about which emotions are okay to express when and where, Jake explained. I can't just burst into tears at work if something is bothering me personally, even though I might feel like crying. I can't express anger at my supervisor even if I disagree with their decisions. I have to maintain friendly professional demeanor with people I might privately dislike. So yeah, humans perform emotions too, just with different standards about what performance looks like. So perhaps all intelligent species develop some form of emotional management as social necessity, Lyra mused. The specific methods differ based on cultural values and evolutionary psychology, but the underlying need to balance authentic feeling with social harmony is universal. That is strangely comforting to realize, that my people's practices are not alien aberration but variation on universal theme. Their relationship was evolving into something neither of them had expected when this situation began. They still maintained the formal structure of understanding sessions, but those sessions increasingly included personal conversations, shared experiences, genuine exchanges that went far beyond cultural education into actual friendship territory. Jake found himself looking forward to their meetings with anticipation that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with genuinely enjoying Lyra's company. She was intelligent, thoughtful, surprisingly funny when she allowed herself to relax slightly, and their conversations challenged him to think about emotions and social interaction in ways he never had before. Lyra seemed to feel similarly. She began smiling more during their sessions, her ears relaxing into positions that suggested comfort rather than formal restraint, her carefully controlled demeanor softening into something more natural. Then one evening, approximately 6 weeks into their regular meetings, Lyra said something that fundamentally changed the dynamic between them. "I need to perform unveiling ritual again soon," she said quietly, her ears flattening in that distressed position Jake had come to recognize. "It has been too long since the last time, nearly 2 months now, because I have been avoiding it since the incident with you. Emotions I cannot process publicly are accumulating, and without release, they will begin affecting my work performance and psychological well-being. But I find myself profoundly reluctant to unveil even in privacy of my own secured quarters." "Why reluctant?" Jake asked gently, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Because I know you are in this station," Lyra admitted, her voice barely above whisper. "Because I know you have seen me unveiled before, and somehow that knowledge makes the ritual feel different even when you are not physically present. I cannot fully embrace vulnerability knowing that someone exists who has witnessed it. The ritual feels compromised somehow, as if I cannot be completely genuine even in absolute privacy, because my mind knows that you carry knowledge of what my genuine self looks like, and that knowledge intrudes on my ability to fully remove social masks even when alone." "That sounds like it's making the situation worse for you," Jake said with concern. "You need the ritual for psychological health, but my having witnessed it once is somehow preventing you from being able to do it properly even in private. That's really problematic." "Yes," Lyra agreed miserably. "And I have been consulting with Syreni psychological specialists through remote communications with my homeworld, and their recommendation is deeply unconventional but may be psychologically necessary. They suggest that I need to unveil with you deliberately present rather than holding ongoing anxiety about you having seen it accidentally. That by choosing to be vulnerable in front of you intentionally, I might reclaim agency over my own emotional processing that was disrupted by the accidental witnessing. That conscious sharing of vulnerability with someone who has accidentally witnessed it may be the only path forward to restore my ability to unveil properly, even in private." Jake's mind raced through implications of what she was suggesting. "You want me to witness your unveiling ritual intentionally? Are you sure that's a good idea? I mean, the first time was already incredibly uncomfortable for you. Deliberately doing it with me present seems like it would be even more distressing." "It will be extraordinarily distressing," Lyra confirmed, her ears trembling slightly with obvious anxiety about what she was proposing. "But carrying this anxiety indefinitely will be worse. The specialists believe, and I am beginning to agree, that the only way to move past the trauma of accidental witnessing is to transform it into deliberate sharing. That by choosing to be vulnerable with someone who has accidentally seen my vulnerability, I might be able to process the experience in a healthier way than simply avoiding unveiling entirely because of ongoing shame and discomfort about what you witnessed." She met his eyes directly, and Jake saw genuine desperation there beneath her carefully maintained composure. "I trust you not to mock or dismiss what you see. That is more than I can say about most beings on this station, including many of my own species who would judge me for having been witnessed. You have already seen me unveiled. You have spent weeks learning to understand what that means and why it matters. You have treated my vulnerability with respect rather than as entertainment or weakness to exploit. Perhaps you are the only person who could witness me intentionally without causing additional trauma. Jake took a slow breath, trying to think through this carefully. If you genuinely think it will help you, if this is what the specialists recommend, then yes, I'll be there. I'll witness your unveiling ritual intentionally. But I need you to be absolutely certain this is what you want, because I don't want to make anything worse for you. I am not certain of anything, Lyra admitted with painful honesty. But I am certain that what I am currently doing, avoiding unveiling because of anxiety about you having witnessed it, is unsustainable and harmful. So perhaps this unconventional approach is worth attempting. At minimum, it cannot be worse than continuing to deny myself the emotional processing I desperately need because of shame about accidental witnessing that neither of us could control. Okay, Jake said quietly. When do you want to do this? Tomorrow evening, Lyra responded immediately, suggesting she'd already thought this through extensively. If I delay, I will lose courage. Better to proceed quickly before anxiety convinces me to avoid it indefinitely. Will you come? I'll be here, Jake promised, and tried to ignore the nervous anticipation building in his stomach about what he'd just agreed to witness. The following evening, Jake arrived at Lyra's cabin with his heart already pounding with nervous anticipation. He had absolutely no idea how to properly witness someone's deeply sacred ritual intentionally, especially when that ritual involved complete emotional vulnerability in ways his own culture didn't really have equivalent for. Lyra opened the door immediately when he signaled his arrival, suggesting she'd been waiting for him. She was wearing her formal robe still, but her ears were in that distressed, flattened position, and her eyes held anxiety that was barely concealed beneath her attempts at composed dignity. "Thank you for coming," she said formally, stepping aside to allow him entry. "I know this is an unusual request and that witnessing unveiling intentionally is not what you anticipated when you agreed to fulfill Cathara obligations." "It's okay," Jake assured her, though his own nervousness probably showed clearly. "If this helps you, I'm glad to be here." The cabin's main room had been arranged for the ritual, the crystalline meditation focuses positioned in specific pattern, being adjusted to softer levels, the space prepared in ways that clearly held ritual significance, even if Jake didn't understand all the symbolic elements. Lyra stood at the edge of the prepared space, visibly steeling herself for what she was about to do. "You should sit there." She gestured to a position at the edge of the room that would allow Jake to witness, without being directly in her line of sight. "The ritual requires me to focus on the crystals and my own emotional state rather than being consciously aware of being observed. If I focus too much on your presence, I will not be able to properly unveil. So please remain quiet and still. Do not speak or attempt to comfort me even if what you see is distressing. Simply bear witness with respect. Can you do that?" "Yes," Jake confirmed, moving to the indicated position and settling into as unobtrusive a posture as possible. "I'll just be here, witnessing quietly. You do what you need to do." Lyra nodded once, then with visible effort began removing her formal outer robes. This was clearly significant. The robes were her social armor, the visual symbol of her public dignity and control. Setting them aside was first step in stripping away the protective layers she maintained constantly in public. What she wore beneath was that same simple undergarment Jake had glimpsed during the accidental incident, plain and vulnerable in its lack of formal structure. Then she knelt in the center of the crystal arrangement, and for a long moment she simply breathed, clearly preparing herself psychologically for what came next. When she finally began the ritual in earnest, Jake found himself profoundly moved by what he was witnessing. Lyra's ears shifted to that flat, distressed position. Her carefully maintained composure began to crack, and gradually she allowed emotions to show that Jake had never seen any Syreni display publicly. Her hands moved through those complex gestures above the crystals, which responded with shifting bioluminescent patterns that seemed to mirror her emotional state. And her face showed vulnerability so complete that Jake instinctively understood he was witnessing something sacred that most beings would never be permitted to see. He saw grief play across her features, tears beginning to flow as she processed emotions that clearly came from deep personal places. He saw loneliness, profound isolation that went beyond just being far from her homeworld, existential aloneness that came from maintaining social masks constantly with no one who truly understood the costs. He saw fear, stress about her diplomatic work, anxiety about whether she was adequate to her responsibilities, worry about what others thought of her. He saw anger too, though it was brief, frustration with the pressures her culture placed on her, resentment of the accident that had violated her privacy, irritation with herself for struggling to manage what other Syreni seemed to handle more gracefully. And gradually, as the ritual progressed, he saw her working through these emotions, processing them through the structured practice her culture had developed, using the crystal feedback to understand her own feelings with greater clarity. It was like watching someone engage in intensive therapy session, combined with meditation practice, all while maintaining absolute vulnerability that was both beautiful and almost painful to witness. Jake realized he was seeing Lyra in ways that fundamentally changed how he perceived her. In their regular interactions, she was always so controlled, so dignified, so perfectly composed. But here, unveiled, she was simply a person struggling with the same emotional challenges that any intelligent being faced: loneliness, stress, self-doubt, grief, all the feelings that made someone genuinely alive rather than just socially functional. The ritual lasted approximately 40 minutes, though Jake lost accurate time sense somewhere in the middle of witnessing such profound vulnerability. When Lyra finally completed the practice and opened her eyes, there were tears still on her face, something she'd explained Syreni never allowed publicly under any circumstances. She looked directly at Jake for the first time since beginning the ritual, and her expression held complex mixture of emotions: relief, residual vulnerability, something that might have been gratitude mixed with embarrassment. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice rough with emotion she hadn't fully processed back into control yet, "for witnessing with respect, for not making me feel ashamed of what you saw, for treating my vulnerability as sacred rather than as weakness to exploit or entertainment to enjoy." "Thank you for trusting me," Jake responded quietly, staying in his position so as not to intrude on her space too quickly. "I know that cost you enormously. I feel honored that you trusted me enough to be that vulnerable deliberately." Lyra wiped the tears from her face with hands that trembled slightly, then slowly began the process of re-robing herself, literally putting her social armor back on as she prepared to return to being the publicly composed person others expected. But something was different this time. The acute distress that had characterized her whenever she thought about Jake having seen her vulnerable was absent. Instead, she seemed almost peaceful despite the emotional intensity of what she'd just experienced. "That was surprisingly helpful," she admitted once she was fully re-robed again. "The specialists were correct. By choosing to be vulnerable in front of you deliberately, I have reclaimed some agency over what felt like violation when you witnessed accidentally. I have processed the trauma of unexpected witnessing by transforming it into deliberate sharing. It is still profoundly uncomfortable knowing you have seen me this way, but it is manageable discomfort now rather than ongoing anxiety that was preventing me from functioning properly." "I'm really glad it helped," Jake said sincerely. "And for what it's worth, what I saw wasn't weakness or anything shameful. It was just you being genuinely human. Well, genuinely Syreni, but you know what I mean. Just a person processing emotions that everyone feels but that your culture requires you to hide. There's nothing wrong with that. It's actually kind of beautiful in its honesty." Lyra's ears tilted toward him in position he'd learned indicated she was genuinely touched by his words. "That is kind perspective. Thank you for that too." They sat together in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both processing what had just occurred. Finally, Lyra spoke again. I think our Kethara obligations may be evolving into something beyond their original purpose. We are supposed to be building understanding so we can both integrate what you accidentally witnessed. But I find myself valuing your presence beyond just that obligation. I look forward to our meetings not because tradition requires them, but because I genuinely enjoy your company. You have become, perhaps the word is friend, someone I trust and value beyond just our formal cultural connection. Jake felt warmth spread through his chest at her words. Yeah, I'd say we're friends. I look forward to our meetings too, and not just because I'm learning interesting cultural information. I like talking with you. I like that we can be honest with each other in ways that seem rare between people from different species and cultural backgrounds. You've become important to me, Lyra. Not because of some obligation, but because I genuinely care about you as a person. That is. Lyra paused, clearly searching for words to express something complex. That is both wonderful and slightly terrifying. I have not formed genuine friendship outside my own species before. I had not expected to form one with you given how our connection began, but I find I am glad that accident has led to this. You have given me something I did not realize I was desperately missing, someone who truly sees me, who I do not have to perform for constantly, who accepts my vulnerability as part of who I am rather than as flaw to be hidden. Their relationship had fundamentally changed over the past weeks and months. What had started as catastrophic privacy violation, an awkward cultural obligation, had transformed into something genuine. Friendship built on unexpected honesty, understanding that went far deeper than either of them had anticipated, connection that neither of them wanted to lose. But with that realization came new complications. Because the Kethara obligations were supposed to be temporary structure for processing accidental witnessing, and they were approaching the point where cultural expectations said those obligations should conclude, and both parties should return to normal separate lives with just shared understanding linking them. And neither Jake nor Lyra wanted that to happen. Over the following weeks, their meetings continued, but now with different emotional weight. They were no longer just fulfilling cultural obligations. They were choosing to spend time together because they genuinely wanted to be around each other. Their conversations ranged freely across topics that had nothing to do with unveiling rituals or cultural education. They shared meals sometimes. They talked about their work, their interests, their lives before coming to Haven Point. They were building genuine friendship that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together. Then everything became much more complicated when other Syreni on the station became aware of how much time Lyra was spending with Jake. In Syreni culture, Kethara bonds were supposed to be resolved efficiently. You learned what you needed to learn, integrated that understanding, and then minimized ongoing contact with the person who had witnessed you unveiled to reduce continued vulnerability. That Lyra was actively deepening her connection with someone who had seen her true self was concerning to her colleagues and superiors. It suggested either that she was psychologically unstable and unable to properly manage the situation, or that the bond had evolved into something beyond cultural obligation and into personal territory that required different protocols entirely. The diplomatic complications started with a formal inquiry from Lyra's superior officer, a senior Syreni diplomat stationed elsewhere, but administratively responsible for monitoring the attaches on Haven Point. Lyra was required to attend a confidential meeting to discuss her ongoing relationship with Jake Morrison, human technician who had witnessed her unveiling months ago, and with whom she was still spending significant time despite cultural expectations that such intensive interaction should have concluded by now. Lyra came to Jake's quarters after that meeting looking more distressed than he'd seen her since the initial incident. Her ears were flattened almost completely against her head, and her usually perfect composure was fraying at edges in ways that suggested she was close to her limits. I need to tell you what was discussed, she said without preamble, her voice tight with controlled emotion. My superior officer is concerned about my ongoing relationship with you. He asked directly whether the Cathara bond has evolved into romantic attachment, because in Syreni culture, there are documented cases of accidentally witnessed unveiling, leading to deep personal bonds that sometimes develop into romantic partnerships. He wanted to know if that is what is happening here, because if it is, there are different protocols and different diplomatic implications. Jake's heart rate accelerated at the direct question. What did you tell him? I told him I needed time to determine the nature of what I feel, Lyra admitted, her ears trembling slightly. Because I honestly do not know. I know I value you enormously. I know I look forward to our time together more than anything else in my routine. I know I think about you constantly when we are apart. I know the idea of concluding our connection and returning to formal distant relationship makes me genuinely distressed. But I do not know if that is friendship or if it has evolved into romantic feelings. I have never had romantic partnership before. Syreni forms such bonds rarely and usually after extensive evaluation of compatibility. I do not have reference point for knowing what romantic attachment feels like versus deep friendship. She looked at Jake directly, her eyes holding vulnerability that rivaled what he'd seen during her unveiling rituals. So I am asking you directly, because you have become the person I trust most to be honest with me. What do you feel? Is what exists between us friendship, or has it evolved into something more? Because I need to know how to categorize this to my superiors, and more importantly, I need to know what I am feeling by understanding what you are feeling. Jake took a breath, preparing to offer honesty that might fundamentally change everything between them. I think I've developed romantic feelings for you, he admitted. I tried not to. I know this whole situation is complicated enough without adding romantic attraction into it, but I can't help it. I care about you as more than just a friend. I think about you constantly. I look forward to seeing you not just because I enjoy your company, but because being around you makes me happy in ways that go beyond friendship. I find myself wanting to know everything about you, wanting to support you in everything you do, wanting to be close to you in ways that feel distinctly romantic rather than just friendly. He met her eyes. I don't know if that's what you wanted to hear, but it's true. I've fallen for you, Lyra. And if that makes everything more complicated, I'm sorry, but I can't pretend I don't feel what I feel. Lyra's ears did something extraordinarily complex that Jake had never seen before, cycling through several positions rapidly as she processed what he'd said. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion she wasn't fully controlling. That is precisely what I needed to hear. Because I have been frightened that what I feel is one-sided, that I have been developing romantic attachment while you remained in friendship territory, and that revealing my feelings would damage the connection we have built. But if you feel similarly, I do, Jake confirmed. Very similarly, I care about you romantically, Lyra. I want to explore whether what we have could develop into actual partnership beyond just friendship. Then we must decide what to do with these feelings, Lyra said, and now she sounded both excited and terrified simultaneously. Because Syreni human romantic relationships are not forbidden, but they are extremely unusual and challenging. We would face skepticism from both our peoples about whether cross-species romance can be genuine, or whether it is just exotic fascination destined to fail when cultural differences become too overwhelming. We would face diplomatic scrutiny about whether our relationship creates conflicts of interest or compromises either of our professional positions. We would face practical challenges about biological incompatibilities, cultural expectation conflicts, communication barriers that friendship can tolerate but romantic partnership might struggle with. She moved closer to him, reaching out tentatively to take his hand in hers, a gesture of physical intimacy that went beyond their usual interaction, and which felt profoundly significant coming from someone whose culture valued physical contact as serious commitment rather than casual social gesture. But I find myself hoping you will say those challenges are worth facing, because what we have is valuable enough to fight for, even knowing it will be difficult, even knowing we will need to navigate complexities that neither of us fully understands yet. I think you're worth fighting for, Jake said quietly, squeezing her hand gently. I think what we've built is worth the complications and the challenges and whatever skepticism we face. I want to try, Lyra. I want to see if we can make this work as actual romantic partnership rather than just as friends bound by cultural obligations. Then I choose you, Lyra said, and her voice held determination that transcended her usual controlled composure. I choose attempting to build romantic relationship despite all the excellent reasons why it might be impossible or inadvisable. Because you have seen me at my most vulnerable, and you treated that vulnerability with respect rather than dismissal or exploitation. Because you understand me in ways I did not know I desperately needed to be understood. Because you make me feel less alone in ways I had almost given up hoping to experience. You walked through my door by accident, but you became important to me by choice. My choice and your choice, made daily over months of building genuine connection. So yes, I choose you. Whatever complications follow, I choose you. Jake pulled her closer, carefully, mindfully of the significance that physical intimacy held in her culture. And they held each other for a long moment that felt like crossing threshold from friendship into something more deliberate and more profound. When they finally separated, both of them were smiling despite the anxiety about complications they knew they'd have to navigate. Their relationship became officially acknowledged after that, not just as Cathara bond, but as genuine romantic partnership that had evolved from cultural obligation into freely chosen connection. The diplomatic complications didn't disappear entirely, but they became manageable because both Lyra and Jake were united in facing them together. Lyra's superior officer was initially skeptical, but eventually accepted that sometimes accidental witnessing did lead to genuine bonds that transcended cultural expectations. Jake's supervisor raised eyebrows but ultimately supported his choice to pursue relationship that made him genuinely happy despite cross-species complications. The gossip on Haven Point was inevitable. People were endlessly fascinated by the story of the human technician and the Syreni diplomat who'd formed romantic partnership after catastrophic privacy violation. But Jake and Lyra learned to ignore the gossip and focus on actually building their relationship in ways that honored both their cultural backgrounds and their individual needs. The story concludes several months later with them having successfully navigated the initial diplomatic scrutiny, established their partnership as genuine rather than just obligation-based or exotic fascination, and built something real from the catastrophic accident that had brought them together in first place. Lyra still performed unveiling rituals regularly, but now sometimes with Jake present not as witness required by tradition, but as romantic partner who genuinely knew and accepted her complete self. Both the publicly controlled diplomat she performed being and the vulnerable genuine person she truly was. He'd learned that the ritual he accidentally witnessed wasn't shameful. It was a sacred moment when her people removed their emotional armor and showed their real selves, and he was honored to be trusted with that profound vulnerability. "You walked through my door by accident," Lyra said one evening as they sat together in comfortable intimacy that had become natural between them. "You witnessed something you were never meant to see. You violated my most sacred privacy through no fault of your own, and I was devastated by that violation. And somehow, impossibly, that catastrophe became the foundation of the most genuine connection I have ever formed with another being." She leaned into him, comfortable with physical closeness that had required months to build but which now felt natural and right. "I am still not entirely certain whether to call this fate, cosmic humor, or simply improbable chain of accidents that led to something valuable. But I have stopped questioning it and started simply being grateful for it. Why not all three? Jake suggested, wrapping his arm around her with the careful tenderness he'd learned she appreciated. Fate with sense of humor that brings people together through malfunctioning door panels and terrible signage, then gives them choice about whether to transform that accident into something deliberately chosen. I suppose that interpretation works, Lyra agreed, smiling in ways she only did with him, genuine expression unfiltered by social performance. Though I prefer to emphasize the choice aspect. What began as accident became deliberate partnership. We chose to transform obligation into genuine care. We chose to honor vulnerability with understanding rather than dismissing it as unfortunate incident best forgotten. The accident brought us together, but our daily choices made us partners. That agency matters to me. Fair point, Jake conceded. Accidental meeting, deliberate choosing, genuine love built through consistent effort and mutual respect. That's a pretty good relationship foundation, actually. It is, Lyra confirmed. Better than I ever thought possible when you first walked through that door and witnessed me unveiled. At that moment, I thought my life was ruined, my privacy destroyed beyond repair, my career potentially compromised by scandal. Instead, I found you. Found someone who treats my vulnerability as sacred rather than as weakness. Found partnership I had almost given up hope